In a humble area of Detroit, known as the automotive heart of the United States, lived a young man named Daniel. He grew up in a loving but resource-limited family. His father worked long hours at a car factory while his mother took care of Daniel and his younger siblings. Despite the hardships, the family always found time to be together and share stories and laughter. From a young age, Daniel was drawn to the world of car racing. He would often spend hours flipping through car magazines he found in the trash or at garage sales, absorbing every detail of the fast machines that filled their pages. While the other boys in the neighborhood played soccer or basketball, Daniel preferred to play with makeshift race cars that he built himself using discarded parts and scraps. Daniel's passion for racing was fueled by the stories his grandfather told him. The old man, a former race car mechanic, had countless tales of the glory days of racing in Detroit. He spoke with enthusiasm about the brave drivers, fearless teams, and thrilling races he had witnessed. These stories enchanted Daniel, who listened to them with shining eyes and a vivid imagination. As he grew older, Daniel developed impressive mechanic skills, learning from his grandfather and eventually fixing neighbors' cars. He also became an avid student of racing, reading everything he could about racing techniques and even practicing on an old racing simulator he found in the basement of an abandoned house. Despite his talent and passion, Daniel knew that the life of a driver was beyond his reach. Racing opportunities were scarce and expensive, and Daniel's family simply didn't have the means to support such an aspiration. However, that didn't stop Daniel from dreaming of the day he would be behind the wheel of a race car, feeling the thrill of speed and the adrenaline of competition. And so, in that humble neighborhood of Detroit, young Daniel nurtured his passion for racing and kept alive the hope that one day he could become the driver he had always dreamed of being. But life, in its relentless and inescapable wisdom, had other plans for him. Daniel was born into a family that, though abundant in love and affection, was economically disadvantaged. His childhood was marked by an undeniable awareness of the financial limitations surrounding his family, a setting that demanded pragmatism rather than fanciful dreams. Reality, with its heavy and inexorable hand, forced Daniel to tread a different path, a path shaped by necessity rather than desire. Instead of pursuing the dream of gliding through tight curves and speeding along endless straights in a race car, he was compelled to wield tools and enter the practical, dirty world of mechanics. This deviation from Daniel's original dream was not without its own challenges. He started working at a young age, learning the trade of fixing broken cars and stubborn engines. Instead of race helmets and overalls, his uniform became the coveralls of a mechanic, stained with oil and grease. Instead of hearing the exhilarating roar of a race engine, he grew accustomed to the metallic sound of screwdrivers and hammers, the gentle hum of a tuned engine, and the occasional pop of a spark plug. Although mechanics wasn't Daniel's first choice, he embraced the trade with a reserved passion. He channeled the same love he felt for race cars into every vehicle he repaired, becoming a master of his craft. Yet, somewhere deep in his mind, the dream of being a driver always persisted, a silent reminder of the path he could have taken if life had been different. With an innate talent for mechanics and an unwavering dedication to his art, Daniel soon became known throughout the city of Detroit. His magical touch with engines and his ability to solve complex mechanical problems were legendary. People came from far and wide to have their cars fixed by him, and his reputation as a master mechanic spread like wildfire through the industrial city. This renown eventually led him to a golden opportunity, a position at Detroit's premier car dealership. It was a world of gleaming cars and roaring engines, a paradise for any car enthusiast. Daniel threw himself into the work with his whole being, but despite his respect and passion for mechanics, the burning desire to become a driver still flickered in his heart, an unrelenting flame that refused to be extinguished. Amidst the hustle and bustle of his life, Daniel met Linda, a woman of strong spirit and a loving heart. Linda, who worked as a nurse, had the ability to see beyond the greasy mechanic and recognized the man of dreams and ambitions that Daniel was. They fell in love, and from their love, a son named Jackson was born. Like his father, Jackson also grew up with an innate love for cars and racing. Daniel saw the reflection of his own childhood in his son, who spent hours playing with toy cars and imagining himself behind the wheel of a race car. Daniel's passion for racing had found a new home in his son's heart. And while Daniel's dream of being a driver still slumbered within him, he now nurtured the hope that, perhaps, his son could one day fulfill that dream. On a particularly hectic day at the workshop, an old, smoking car abruptly parked at the entrance. From it emerged a young couple, both with faces marked by worry and fear. The woman, a beautiful redhead named Sophie, was visibly pregnant, her face contorted with pain, indicating she was in labor. The man, a tall brunette named Thomas, rushed over to Daniel, who was under the hood of a car. The urgency in Thomas's voice was palpable as he pleaded, "Please, you have to help us. The car broke down, and my wife, she's in labor. We need to get to the hospital as soon as possible." Daniel, upon hearing Thomas's plea, lifted his gaze from the engine he was repairing and looked at the couple. He saw the fear in Thomas's eyes and the pain on Sophie's face. And even though he could see that the couple couldn't afford to pay for the repair, the urgency of the situation left him no other choice. "Hurry, let's bring your car inside," said Daniel, already removing his coveralls and heading towards the blazing vehicle. As Thomas helped Sophie settle into a chair in the waiting room, Daniel worked on the car with frenzied efficiency. He repaired the radiator, replaced the fan belt that had snapped, and checked the engine to ensure there would be no more surprises. Within an hour, the car was running again. When Thomas attempted to ask how much he owed, Daniel simply shook his head and said, "Don't worry about it. Just get your wife to the hospital. Good luck to both of you." And with that, the couple profusely thanked Daniel and hurried off toward the hospital, leaving a pensive and concerned Daniel in their wake. However, Daniel's act of generosity was not met with the same kindness by his boss, Mr. Harold, a middle-aged man with a prominent belly and a heart hardened by greed. When Mr. Harold, who had been observing everything from his office through the glass window, saw Thomas and Sophie drive off without paying, he stormed out of his office in a fury. His face was red with anger as he approached Daniel, who was cleaning his tools. "Daniel! What do you think you're doing, fixing cars for free?" snarled Mr. Harold, his eyes narrow with anger. Daniel turned, calmly facing the man. "They needed help, boss. The woman was in labor." "I thought you were here to make money, not play the Good Samaritan," exclaimed Mr. Harold, shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't have an employee giving away my work for free. You're fired, Daniel." Daniel was taken aback but kept his composure. He knew he had done the right thing, and if losing his job was the price to pay, he would accept it. With a nod of his head, he cleaned out his locker and, without saying a word, walked out of the workshop, leaving behind the greedy boss and a job he had once loved. Daniel went through a series of jobs after his dismissal, working as a truck driver, a janitor, and even in a few other mechanic shops. Despite the hardships and long hours, Daniel never let himself be discouraged. He knew he had a family to support, and he would do whatever it took to provide them with a better life. While Daniel struggled to make ends meet, Jackson, the boy with dreamy eyes, found his passion aligned with his father's, cars. He collected miniature models, watched every race he could on television, and talked incessantly about becoming a race car driver. Daniel, however, worried. He saw in Jackson the same dream he had once had and feared that his son would also face the same disappointment. On a Sunday afternoon, when Jackson turned 11, after months of saving and planning, Daniel surprised Jackson with 2 tickets to a real race at the local racetrack. "Jackson," he said, showing him the tickets, "we're going to see a real race." The excitement on Jackson's face was palpable. His eyes sparkled with anticipation, and he couldn't stop bouncing around the place. When they finally arrived at the racetrack, the roar of the engines, the smell of burning rubber, and the gleam of the fast cars were overwhelming for the boy. He was ecstatic, his eyes fixed on the track, following every move of the race cars. Daniel watched Jackson, his son's eyes reflecting the gleam of the cars on the track. And in that moment, a flame ignited within him. He knew he had to do something, not just for himself, but for his son's dream. He couldn't let Jackson go through the same frustrations he had experienced. He had to find a way to help Jackson become a race car driver. As Daniel and Jackson reveled in the roar of the engines and the electrifying atmosphere of the race, a familiar voice resonated from behind them, "Daniel? Daniel Smith?" Daniel turned around, his eyes meeting a man who seemed vaguely familiar. The man smiled, extending his hand. "It's me, Thomas. Remember me?" Memories flooded Daniel. Thomas was the desperate man he had helped years ago, the man with the wife in labor whose car Daniel had repaired. "Thomas. Of course, I remember. How are you and your wife?" Thomas smiled and looked at a little brown-haired boy playing nearby. "We're doing well. This is Vincent, the boy you helped bring into the world." Daniel looked at Vincent, his eyes widening. "So, he's the baby who was on the way that night?" Thomas nodded. "Yes. And thanks to you, he's here today." The umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck. The doctors said that if we had taken a few more minutes, it wouldn't have been possible to save him. But because of you, he's alive and healthy. Thomas's gaze then turned more serious. "Back then, I was just a struggling engineering student with an old car. My girlfriend got pregnant, and we were going through hardships. But since then, things have changed." He paused, looking at Daniel with gratitude. "After Vincent was born, I managed to graduate and started a tech company. Now, we're one of the biggest companies in the industry, and we sponsor one of the racing teams here." Daniel looked at Thomas, surprised and touched. He could never have imagined that his simple act of kindness had affected someone's life so profoundly. Thomas looked at Daniel, a glow of gratitude in his eyes. "Daniel, after everything you've done for me and my family, I need to repay you in some way. What can I do for you?" Daniel hesitated for a moment, then looked at Jackson, who was still enthralled by the race. "Well, my son Jackson, he dreams of being a driver. He would love to have the chance to ride in one of the go-karts." Thomas's expression brightened, and he let out a warm laugh. "Is that all? Daniel, after what you've done for me, I can do much more than just letting Jackson drive a go-kart." He turned to Jackson, who was now paying attention to the conversation. "Jackson, how about a chance to test for the racing team? And, Daniel," Thomas turned back to him, "you're a great mechanic. We need someone like you on our team." Daniel was speechless, surprised and moved by the generous offer. He looked at Jackson, who had a huge smile on his face, and then at Thomas. "Thomas, I don't know what to say. You have no idea how much this means to us." With tears in his eyes, he reached out his hand to Thomas. "I'd like to invite you, Sophie, and Vincent for a dinner at my house. I want to thank you personally, and my wife Linda would love to meet you as well." Thomas smiled and shook Daniel's hand. "It would be a pleasure, Daniel. We look forward to it." And so, the bond between the two families grew stronger, united by an act of kindness and a shared love for car racing. 9 years later, on a sunny afternoon that shimmered with the promise of something incredible, Daniel stood at the finish line of the racetrack. The roar of the engines filled the air, a melody that played directly in his heart. But among all the drivers, there was one who held a special place in his heart, his son, Jackson. Daniel's heart pounded as he watched car number 27 approach, a streak of light and speed. Jackson was behind the wheel, a look of determination on his face reflected in the rearview mirror. And then, in a burst of euphoria, Jackson crossed the finish line, the crowd erupting in applause and cheers. Lights flashed, people screamed, but all Daniel heard was the sound of pride pulsating through his veins. He looked up, his eyes brimming with uncontainable tears. "You did it, my boy," he whispered to himself, his heart overflowing with joy. Jackson stepped out of the car, a smile lighting up his sweaty face as he held the champion's trophy high in the air. He searched the crowd for his father, and when their eyes met, Daniel waved, a smile on his face so wide it could hardly contain it. Daniel never achieved his dream of becoming a driver. Life took him on a different path, one that made him a mechanic, a husband, and a father. But now, seeing Jackson live the dream they both shared, he realized that it was more than enough. The happiness he felt watching his son triumph surpassed any dream he could have had for himself. "This is for you, Dad," Jackson shouted to him in the crowd. And in that moment, Daniel knew that his dream had come true in a way he could never have imagined. Still with his heart racing from Jackson's race, Daniel was taken aback when Thomas approached him, extending a delicate ivory envelope. "For you, Daniel," said Thomas, his gaze full of pleasant mystery. With a questioning look, Daniel opened the envelope and pulled out a note written in elegant handwriting and a pair of shiny keys. The note read, "Daniel, on that distant day at the workshop, you not only saved my son's life but also planted the seed that allowed your own son to fulfill his dreams. The generosity of your heart touched our lives in ways you could never imagine. Now, it's your turn." With the words echoing in his mind, Daniel looked at Thomas, perplexed. What did he mean? Noticing his confusion, Thomas smiled and pointed beyond the crowd, to a sparkling race car parked near the track. It was a beautiful vehicle, glistening in the sun, its aerodynamic body seemingly made for speed. "It's yours, Daniel," Thomas said, his smile widening as he saw the surprise on Daniel's face. "I secured a spot in the upcoming amateur race." "You always dreamed of being a driver, didn't you?" "It's never too late to dream, my friend." Emotion choked Daniel, the words catching in his throat. He looked at the car, at the keys in his hand, and then at Thomas. His dreams, which he believed had been buried in the past, were now before him, as real as the sun shining above. With tears in his eyes and a smile mirroring Thomas's, Daniel finally managed to whisper gratefully, "Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for making my dream come true." With tear-filled eyes, Daniel embraced Thomas. He could hardly believe the generosity of this man, whom he had helped on an ordinary day so many years ago. Then, he turned to see Jackson running towards him, the championship trophy still in his hands. Jackson's face was lit up with a smile so wide that it made Daniel laugh. At the end of that day at the Detroit racetrack, not just one but two dreams came true. One boy became a champion, and one man was given the chance to finally pursue his dream. It all happened because, one day, Daniel decided to help a stranger. And that was the true victory. And thus concludes the incredible story of Daniel, Jackson, and Thomas. A story that teaches us to never give up on our dreams, and that love, kindness, and generosity always find a way to come back to us in unexpected ways. This story is an inspiring reminder that no matter where we start, there is always a path to reach our dreams. Even when dreams seem distant and unreachable, you never know when an act of kindness can change the course of our lives. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. If you were touched by this story, please don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends. And, of course, if you're not subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. Remember, it's never too late to dream and make a difference in someone's life. Until the next video.